was a long day. I know how you feel. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the world outside start to fade away. Welcome back to the mental lullaby. Tonight, we aren't just looking for rest. We're giving your mind the permission it needs to let go. Using gentle psychological techniques and calming soundscapes will guide your nervous systems from the noise of the day into the quiet of the night. You have done enough for today. Now, it's time to simply be. Let's begin our journey into sleep.
The entire story of Captain Price from Call of Duty, a complete narrative journey through war, loss, and redemption. Script by Mental Lullaby. Introduction. The legend. There are names in gaming that carry weight. Master Chief, Solid Snake, Commander Shepard. These are characters who transcend their games, who become symbols of something larger. Then there's Captain John Price, a man whose story spans world wars and modern conflicts, whose face has become synonymous with Call of Duty itself, whose simple act of sliding a pistol across blood-stained concrete became one of gaming's most iconic moments. You see that boonie hat, that weathered face marked by countless battles, that distinctive mustache that's seen more war zones than most people can imagine, and you know exactly who you're looking at. You hear that gravelly British voice cutting through the chaos of combat, delivering orders with the kind of authority that comes only from years of hard-won experience, and something in you stands a little straighter, pays a little more attention. Captain Price isn't just a character. He's become something of a gaming institution, a touchstone for an entire franchise, the face you think of when someone mentions Call of Duty. But how did we get here? How did this British officer, originally just another NPC in a World War II game, become the beating heart of one of the most successful video game franchises in history? The answer to that question takes us on a journey spanning multiple timelines, different wars, and enough tragedy to break any normal person. Because Price's story isn't just about missions accomplished and enemies defeated. It's about the weight of command, the burden of making impossible choices, the cost of surviving when so many others don't. This is a story that begins in the deserts of North Africa during World War II, where the original Price fought against Nazi forces in some of the war's most brutal campaigns. It continues through the radioactive wasteland of Pripyat in 1996, where a young Lieutenant Price took a shot that would haunt him for 15 years and set in motion events leading to nuclear detonations and World War. It crescendos through the modern warfare of the 2000s and 2010s, where Captain Price led Task Force 141 against terrorists, ultranationalists, and even his own government when they betrayed him. And then, because one epic wasn't enough, it all starts again in a rebooted timeline where a younger Price fights new wars against familiar enemies, forming a new Task Force 141, training new soldiers, and inevitably losing them to the same violence that has defined his entire existence. This isn't a simple story of good versus evil, of clear victories and happy endings. This is a story about a man who exists in the gray spaces between right and wrong, who makes the calls that politicians won't, who carries out the missions that officially never happened, who saves the world multiple times yet finds himself hunted and disavowed for his actions. Over the next several hours of your time, we're going to walk through every major moment of Captain Price's life across all timelines. We'll experience the horror of his failed assassination attempt in Pripyat and understand how a near miss changed the course of history. will feel the weight of that pistol he slides to soap on a bridge in Russia, understanding it's not just a weapon but a transfer of trust, of responsibility, of brotherhood. We'll watch him launch a nuclear missile at his own country to save it, watch him lose everyone he cares about, watch him finally strangle his greatest enemy atop a Dubai hotel, and watch him do it all over again in a different timeline because some men are simply built for war. So settle in, get comfortable, and prepare for a journey through one of gaming's most comprehensive character arcs. This is the complete, unabridged, deeply detailed story of Captain John Price, told as it deserves to be told, with all the weight and significance these moments carried. Because Price's story isn't just about one soldier in one game. It's about what it means to lead when the world is ending, to fight when you've already lost everything, to make the call that no one else is willing to make. It's about the cost of duty, the burden of survival, and the question of whether a man like Price can ever truly find peace, or if he's doomed to fight forever. Let's find out together. Chapter 1. The World War II Foundation. Before the modern Captain Price became an icon, before Pripyat and Task Force 141, before boonie hats and signature cigars, there was another Price. Same rank, same British military heritage, same unwavering dedication to duty, but fighting a different war entirely. This is where the legend began, even if few players today remember this original incarnation. The year was 1942, and the world was burning. Nazi Germany had conquered most of Europe, Japan was rampaging through the Pacific, and the Allies were fighting desperately to turn the tide. In North Africa, British forces under Montgomery were engaging Rommel's Afrika Korps in a series of brutal desert campaigns that would determine control of the Suez Canal and Middle Eastern oil fields. And their commanding elements of the 7th Armored Division was Captain Price. This Price, voiced by Michael Goff in those early Call of Duty games, wasn't quite the same character we'd come to know. His appearance was different, wearing a beret instead of the iconic boonie hat that would later define the character. His personality was less developed, the technology of the time limiting how much character depth games could convey. But the core was there, that essence of leadership, that British military professionalism, that ability to stay calm under fire that would define every version of Price to follow. October 29, 1942, during the Second Battle of El Alamein, players first encountered this Captain Price. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, sand dunes rolling toward horizons that shimmered with heat. The sun beat down mercilessly on British troops dug into defensive positions, waiting for orders, checking weapons, trying to stay hydrated in conditions that could kill you as surely as any German bullet. Price wasn't behind a desk somewhere safe. He was forward with his men, leading from the front as he always would. His orders were clear but daunting. Lead Sergeant John Davis and Private McGregor, along with elements of the 7th Armored Division, to destroy an enemy supply depot and secure any intelligence documents found there. Supply depot destruction missions sound simple on paper. You locate the target, you blow it up, you extract. But in reality, in the chaos of actual combat in the North African desert, nothing was simple. German forces were dug in, well supplied, and had no intention of letting the British waltz in and destroy their logistics. Price and his men moved under cover of darkness, navigating minefields that could reduce a man to red mist in an instant. avoiding patrols that would sound the alarm if they spotted the infiltration team, working their way closer to the depot. Every step was calculated, every decision potentially the difference between success and getting his entire unit killed. They reached the depot as dawn began to break across the desert. That golden light that makes everything look beautiful right before men start dying. The attack was swift and brutal. Price's team hit multiple targets simultaneously, overwhelmed the German defenders before they could mount an organized resistance, planted explosives on ammunition stores and fuel dumps, and secured the documents they'd come for. The explosions that followed lit up the desert sky, sending columns of black smoke rising into the morning air. Mission accomplished, but Price knew better than to celebrate. The explosions would draw German reinforcements like blood draws sharks, and they needed to be long gone before those reinforcements arrived. But there was no time for extraction. Even as the last flames from the depot were still climbing skyward, new orders came through. British forces were stretched thin across the desert, and a small town 30 miles south of El Alamein, positioned at a critical choke point in the minefields, was under threat. If the Germans took that town, they could break through the British defensive lines and threaten the entire position. Price and his exhausted men were the closest unit available. They had to redeploy immediately, had to get to that town and hold it until proper reinforcements could arrive. No rest, no recovery time, just straight from one desperate battle to another. This was the reality of desert warfare, the truth that the history books sometimes glossed over. You didn't fight one battle and then rest. You fought until you couldn't fight anymore, and then you fought some more. They reached the town and dug in, preparing defensive positions, setting up fields of fire, coordinating with a few other British troops already there. And then the Germans came, waves of them supported by armor, determined to break through this British strongpoint. Price held that town. He held it through repeated assaults, through artillery bombardment, through circumstances that should have been overwhelming. He coordinated the defense, moved between positions to shore up weak points, personally engaged enemy forces when they broke through the perimeter, and refused to give ground. The game shows Sergeant Davis and Private McGregor fighting alongside him, following his orders, trusting his leadership, and somehow, against the odds, they survived this particular engagement. The town held. The German advance was stopped. The choke point remained in British hands, and the Allied defensive line remained intact. It was the kind of victory that would barely rate a footnote in the official histories. A small battle in a vast war, but to the men who fought there, to the soldiers whose lives depended on Price's leadership, it was everything. But Price's war was far from over. The North African campaign continued for months, and Price continued fighting. We saw him again helping to clear minefields, coordinating with the 7th Armored Division to destroy German ships, conducting raid after raid, operation after operation, always leading, always surviving. Then came June 6, 1944, D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in human history, the operation that would determine the fate of occupied Europe. And Captain Price was there, commanding D Company, 2nd Battalion of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. Their target was Pegasus Bridge, a deceptively simple structure spanning the Caen Canal. But that bridge held massive strategic importance. German reinforcements stationed in Calais could use it to reach the invasion beaches and hit the Allied forces from the flank. If those reinforcements got through, D-Day could fail. The invasion could turn into a massacre. Price couldn't let that happen. No pressure, just the fate of the entire Western Allied campaign resting on successfully taking and holding one bridge. The insertion was done via glider, those wooden and fabric death traps that soldiers had to ride in complete darkness, hoping the pilots would find the landing zone, hoping they wouldn't crash, hoping they'd survive long enough to get out and fight. Price's glider landed on the eastern bank of the Canal at 0007 hours, just 7 minutes after midnight on June 6th. The landing was textbook perfect, silent and undetected. The German forces guarding the bridge had no idea British airborne troops had just landed less than 100 meters away. That element of surprise was crucial, and Price used it ruthlessly. The attack was fast and overwhelming. British soldiers poured out of the gliders and hit the German blocking force before they could properly respond. There was a Panzer IV tank that could have turned the tide, that could have shredded the lightly armed airborne troops, but Sergeant Evans and Army Engineer Private Mills managed to destroy it with anti-tank weapons before it could bring its main gun to bear. The Germans, shocked and outgunned, retreated from Benouville, but they'd prepared for the possibility of losing the bridge. They'd rigged it with explosives, enough to drop the entire structure into the canal and deny its use to the Allies. If those charges went off, D-Day's carefully coordinated plan would start falling apart. Price's men discovered the explosives had been removed from their detonation positions and stowed in a nearby pillbox. Whether this was German incompetence, sabotage by French resistance, or just incredible luck, no one knew. But it saved the bridge, saved the mission, and quite possibly saved D-Day itself. They held the bridge throughout the morning, fighting off German counterattacks, suffering casualties but refusing to give ground. At 0800 hours, reinforcements from the 13th Parachute Battalion arrived from Ranville, and the bridge was truly secure. The invasion could proceed. Allied forces could move inland without worrying about German reinforcements hitting them from an unexpected direction. Pegasus Bridge remained in Allied hands, and D-Day succeeded, and while many factors contributed to that success, Price and his men had done their part. One bridge, one company of soldiers, one captain making the right calls under impossible pressure. The war continued for Price through the Normandy campaign. He fought through St. Louet, leading his men to secure key buildings and flak positions, including the German Field HQ. When tanks were lost and the 7th Armored Division was ordered to fall back to Commout, Price conducted a fighting retreat through Aimé-sur-Soules. It was there, on the dawn of June 14th, under heavy mortar fire, that Price proved his worth again. The Germans were hammering their position, trying to destroy the retreating British forces, but Price and his men didn't just run. They eliminated the mortar team shelling them, assaulted and captured the German Field HQ, and held the position against counterattacks that included a Tiger tank. By holding at Aimé-sur-Soules, even temporarily, Price bought time for the rest of the 7th Armored Division to retreat safely to Commout. He saved lives through his leadership, through his refusal to panic, through his understanding that sometimes the mission isn't advancing but is holding long enough for others to survive. What happened to this Captain Price after the Normandy campaign? The records don't say. After the mission at Aimé-sur-Soules, where the 7th Armored Division successfully retreated to Commout, Price's story in the official Call of Duty campaigns ends. The game doesn't follow him further. leaving his ultimate fate to the imagination. This uncertainty reflects the nature of this earlier Price. He wasn't designed as a fully developed protagonist with a complete character arc. The technology and storytelling conventions of early 2000s first-person shooters focused more on historical authenticity and moment-to-moment gameplay than on deep character development. Price was a supporting character who appeared across several missions, representing British military leadership and giving the player a sense of continuity across different operations. But he mattered. He mattered because when Infinity Ward started developing Call of Duty 4, Modern Warfare, and wanted to create a memorable British SAS character, the design choices suggest they saw a foundation they could build on. They gave the modern Price similar attributes: the leadership presence, the British military professionalism, the calm competence under fire. Then they amplified these traits, aged up the character, and made him central rather than supporting. Whether this represents an intentional legacy, perhaps through family lineage across generations, or simply thematic resonance, the connection enriches both characters. The modern Price carries forward something that began in the deserts of North Africa and the beaches of Normandy, even if the exact nature of that connection remains deliberately ambiguous. This World War II foundation matters because it shows that Price wasn't created in a vacuum. The modern Price stands on the shoulders of this earlier version, carrying forward a legacy of leadership under fire. And that legacy was about to be tested in ways that World War II Price could never have imagined. Because the next version of Price wouldn't just fight in conventional warfare with clear sides and defined enemies. He'd operate in the shadows, in morally gray areas, making choices that would haunt him and change the world. But before he became the captain, before he led Task Force 141, before he became the legend, he had to fail. He had to miss a shot that should have been easy, had to let a target escape, had to set in motion a chain of events that would lead to millions of deaths. He had to go to Pripyat. Chapter 2. Pripyat 1996. The shot that changed everything. Chernobyl. Just speaking the name conjures images of disaster, of a power plant explosion that released radioactive material across Europe, of an entire city evacuated and left to rot, of a tragedy that showed humanity the price of hubris and corner cutting. But on April 26, 1986, when Reactor 4 exploded, when the fires burned for days sending radioactive particles into the atmosphere, when 50,000 residents of nearby Pripyat were told to evacuate temporarily with only essentials because they'd be back in a few days, none of them knew they'd never return. None of them knew their city would become a ghost town, frozen in time, a monument to catastrophe. A decade later, Pripyat still stood empty. Apartments still had furniture and personal belongings left behind by residents who thought they'd be home soon. Schools still had textbooks and papers on desks. Playgrounds still had swings and slides that would never again hear children's laughter. And throughout it all, radiation slowly decayed, making the entire exclusion zone dangerous for decades to come. It was the perfect place for a clandestine arms deal. Think about it from the perspective of black market arms dealers and criminals. You need somewhere isolated where authorities won't interfere, where satellite surveillance is limited, where if something goes wrong, the radioactive contamination will destroy evidence. The Chernobyl exclusion zone checked every box. Even a decade after the disaster, even with cleanup crews having done their work, most people stayed away. Too dangerous, too contaminated, too haunted. But some people were willing to risk radiation exposure for profit. And one of those people was Imran Zakhaev, an ultranationalist Russian with ambitions of returning Russia to Soviet-era power and glory. In 1996, Zakhaev was conducting deals for nuclear material, specifically spent fuel rods from the Chernobyl plant itself. British intelligence learned of this meeting. They understood the implications immediately. Spent fuel rods in the wrong hands could be reprocessed for weapons-grade material, could end up in a dirty bomb, could enable nuclear terrorism on a scale the world had never seen. Cash for spent fuel rods, Price would later remember. That's one hell of a recipe for destruction. The British government made a decision that day, one they hadn't made since World War II. They authorized an assassination. Zakhaev had to die before he could complete this deal, before those fuel rods ended up in the hands of terrorists or rogue states. The mission fell to the 22nd SAS Regiment, specifically to Captain MacMillan and his protege, Lieutenant John Price. This was the first time players encountered the modern Price, though technically it was a flashback mission in Call of Duty 4, set 15 years before the game's main events. And what a first impression it was. All Gillied Up became immediately legendary, one of the most celebrated missions in FPS history, a masterclass in tension and atmosphere that players still talk about decades later. But forget the game design for a moment. Forget the mechanics and the level structure. Focus on what this mission meant for Price's character, for his development, for his future. Because everything that happens in the Modern Warfare series traces back to this mission, to this moment, to the shot that Lieutenant Price was about to take. The insertion was done quietly, Price and MacMillan dressed in full ghillie suits, their weapons wrapped in camouflage netting, moving slowly through the tall grass surrounding Pripyat. The Geiger counter clicked steadily in the background, a constant reminder that the ground itself was trying to kill them with invisible radiation. They had to stay low, stay patient, let the ghillie suits do their work, making them nearly invisible in the overgrown vegetation. MacMillan was the senior officer, the veteran sniper teaching his protege the finer points of the trade. Stay low and move slowly, he instructed as they approached their first contact with enemy patrols. In our ghillie suits, will be impossible to spot. And he was right. 2 ultranationalist guards stood less than 20 meters away, complaining in Russian about their patrol assignment, about having to wander through this radioactive wasteland. They had no idea 2 British SS operators were crawling through the grass nearby, close enough to hear their conversation. Price could have killed them both easily. A quick burst from his suppressed weapon, 2 bodies dropping before they could raise the alarm. But MacMillan knew better. Gunfire, even suppressed gunfire, would alert other patrols. Dead bodies would be discovered. The entire area would go on high alert, and their mission would be compromised before they'd even reached Pripyat proper. So they waited, barely breathing, until the guards moved on. Then they continued their slow crawl toward the city, past abandoned villages, through fields that had once grown crops but now grew only weeds and radiation. They reached Pripyat as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the ghost city in stark detail. And MacMillan spoke the words that would become one of gaming's most quoted lines. Look at this place. 50,000 people used to live in this city. Now it's a ghost town. I've never seen anything like it. The weight in his voice said everything. This wasn't just tactical observation. This was a man confronting the reality of Chernobyl's human cost, seeing the aftermath of a disaster that had turned a thriving city into an abandoned ruin. For a moment, even hardened SAS operators felt the magnitude of what they were witnessing. If you listened carefully as they moved through the palace of culture, you could hear ghostly sounds, like children playing, echoes from before the disaster, memories soaked into the concrete. Whether this was audio design meant to enhance atmosphere or meant to represent actual recordings that lingered in the ruins didn't matter. The effect was haunting, unsettling, a reminder that this place had been full of life before disaster struck. But Price and MacMillan couldn't afford to be haunted. They had a mission, and sentimentality didn't eliminate targets. They moved through apartment buildings and across plazas, avoiding patrols, taking out isolated sentries when necessary, working their way toward the Policia Hotel. The hotel stood tall, abandoned but structurally sound, offering perfect vantage points overlooking the city and the area where Zakhaev's meeting would take place. They made their way to the top floor, set up their position, and waited. Sniper work is 95% patience, 5% action. You find your position, you set up your rifle, you calculate ranges and wind speed, and then you wait. Hours can pass. You stay perfectly still, controlling your breathing, conserving energy, ignoring discomfort, becoming part of the environment. Price and MacMillan waited for hours, watching through their scopes as the sun moved across the sky, as shadows lengthened, as vehicles began arriving below. Men in suits and military uniforms stepped out, conducted security sweeps, prepared for their principal's arrival. And then Zakhaev himself appeared, stepping out of a vehicle, surrounded by bodyguards. But there were other people in the convoy too. In Modern Warfare 3, players would later discover that two other significant figures were present at this meeting, though Price had no way of knowing their importance at the time. Yuri, who would become one of Price's allies years later, was there. Vladimir Makarov, who would become one of the deadliest terrorists in the world, was also present. But in 1996, through Price's scope, they were just additional targets, bodyguards perhaps, their faces unremarkable among the many ultranationalists gathered for the arms deal. Price's focus remained on Zakhaev. MacMillan gave him the readings, wind speed, distance, elevation, all the factors that could affect the shot. Price's breathing slowed, his heart rate dropped, entering that zen-like state that snipers achieve when everything else falls away and there's only the rifle, the target, the shot. Through his scope, he could see Zakhaev clearly. Every detail of the man's face, the way he moved, the confidence in his bearing. This was a man who believed he was untouchable, who thought himself safe in this radioactive wasteland far from oversight or interference. Price's finger rested on the trigger. One shot. One opportunity to prevent countless future deaths, to stop nuclear material from reaching terrorists, to eliminate a man who would use weapons of mass destruction without hesitation. He fired. The Barrett .50 caliber rifle kicked against his shoulder, the suppressor reducing but not eliminating the thunderous report. The bullet flew true, covering over half a mile in less than a second. Price watched through his scope, watched the impact, watched Zakhaev fall. For a moment, he thought it was over. Target down, mission accomplished. Except it wasn't. Based on what the game shows us and what's referenced in later installments, the bullet struck Zakhaev's left arm rather than delivering a fatal hit. The arm was severed, but the man survived. The exact reason for this outcome isn't explicitly stated in the game. It could have been wind shift, a fractional miscalculation, Zakhaev's movement, or simply the unpredictability of long-range shooting. What matters is the result. Instead of eliminating an ultranationalist arms dealer, Price had created a wounded survivor who would later use his missing arm as a powerful symbol, claiming it as proof of Western assassination attempts and rallying support for his cause. The area exploded into chaos. Ultranationalists rushed to Zakhaev, pulling him into a vehicle, applying emergency medical treatment. Someone spotted the muzzle flash from the hotel, and suddenly the entire compound was on alert. A helicopter appeared, circling the Policia Hotel, searching for the shooters. "We've been compromised," MacMillan shouted, and they were running, abandoning their carefully prepared position, racing downstairs and through corridors as gunfire erupted around them. They made it outside, but the helicopter had them spotted. The Mi-28 Havoc gunship opened up with everything it had, autocannons tearing through concrete and rebar. The building they'd used as a vantage point took massive damage, and in the chaos, the helicopter itself crashed, likely from taking return fire or from structural damage to the building affecting its position. MacMillan was struck by debris from the falling helicopter, his leg badly injured. The game shows him unable to walk properly, needing Price's assistance to move. They were deep in enemy territory with hostile forces converging on their position. This moment defined Price as a soldier and showed the kind of leader he would become. Rather than abandoning his wounded captain, Price carried MacMillan toward the extraction point. The game shows this clearly, Price literally carrying his commanding officer through enemy territory, fighting off ultranationalists while protecting the injured MacMillan. They navigated through radiation zones where the Geiger counter's clicking became frantic warnings, past enemy patrols that would have killed them both if discovered. They reached the Pripyat amusement park, that infamous location with its Ferris wheel that never operated, and set up a defensive position while waiting for extraction. The game's final sequence in this mission shows waves of ultranationalist forces attacking their position. Price had to defend both himself and the injured MacMillan, fighting off enemies while MacMillan provided what covering fire he could despite his wounds. When the extraction helicopter finally arrived, both men made it aboard and were lifted to safety. As they escaped Pripyat, Price likely believed the mission had been a qualified success despite complications. They'd survived. MacMillan would recover from his injuries, and while Zakhaev hadn't been killed, he'd been seriously wounded and his arms deal disrupted. What Price couldn't know then was how this event would be used. The game later reveals through dialogue and story elements that Zakhaev survived and leveraged his injury for political gain. The missing arm became a symbol he could point to, evidence he would use to claim Western powers had tried to assassinate him. This propaganda value would help rally ultranationalist support and strengthen his movement. The mission's long-term consequences wouldn't become clear for years. Zakhaev's ultranationalists would grow in power, eventually leading to civil war in Russia. The nuclear detonation that killed 30,000 U.S. Marines, the rise of Vladimir Makarov, World War III itself, these events trace back, at least in part, to this day in Pripyat, to a shot that wounded rather than killed. The weight this mission placed on Price becomes evident through his actions in later games. When he finally confronts Zakhaev again 15 years later in Call of Duty 4, the encounter clearly carries personal significance beyond just completing an objective. The game doesn't explicitly show Price dwelling on Pripyat's failure, but his determination to finish what he started in 1996 suggests the mission stayed with him through the years. But that confrontation was years away. Between 1996 and 2011, Price's career continued within the SAS, eventually earning him promotion to captain and command of his own team. The games don't detail this 15-year period, leaving his intervening operations and experiences to the imagination. When Call of Duty 4: Modern Warfare begins in 2011, Price emerges as an established SAS captain with a reputation for successful operations, ready to train a new generation of soldiers. His next chapter would begin when a cargo ship in the Bering Strait carried nuclear material, when a young sergeant named Soap McTavish passed selection, and when Imran Zakhaev's name surfaced once again in intelligence reports. The Pripyat mission stands as a defining moment in Price's story across the Modern Warfare series. It established the backstory for his relationship with Zakhaev, created the foundation for the original trilogy's central conflict, and demonstrated the kind of soldier Price was long before he became the legendary captain. The mission itself, all gillied up, became one of Call of Duty's most celebrated levels, remembered for its atmosphere, tension, and the way it used a flashback to deepen the main narrative. For Price's character, Pripyat represented both triumph and tragedy. He completed an extremely difficult infiltration mission, saved his commanding officer's life, and survived against overwhelming odds. Yet the primary objective failed, and that failure's consequences would ripple through the next 15 years of his life and career. Chapter 3: Call of Duty 4: Becoming the Captain. 15 years. That's how long Price carried the weight of Pripyat, how long he waited for another chance at Zakhaev. 15 years of distinguished service, of operations both on the record and deep in the shadows, of proving himself again and again until the SAS promoted him to captain and gave him his own team. By 2011, Price was no longer the young lieutenant learning from MacMillan. He was the veteran now, the one with the weathered face and the 1,000-yard stare, the one who'd seen enough combat to know that wars aren't won by individual heroes but by teams working together, by soldiers who trust their leader and each other. His team was small but elite. Sergeant Gaz was his second in command, a solid operator with good instincts who'd proven himself on countless missions. But the newest member, fresh from SAS selection, was an unknown quantity. Sergeant John McTavish, though everyone called him Soap for reasons relating to his speed in urban combat, his ability to clean out a room of hostiles with remarkable efficiency. Price's first words to Soap set the tone for their entire relationship, delivered with that dry British humor that barely concealed the sharp assessment happening behind his eyes. Right? What the hell kind of name is Soap? How to muppet like you pass selection. It was a test, the kind of gentle hazing that all new guys go through, seeing how they react to pressure, to being put on the spot, to their commanding officer immediately questioning their worth. Soap handled it well, keeping his composure, not trying too hard to impress, but showing through his performance in training that he belonged. The FNG course, FNG standing for fucking new guy, put Soap through his paces. Timed runs through obstacle courses, target shooting under pressure, close-quarters combat scenarios, everything designed to test reaction time, accuracy, decision-making under stress. And Soap excelled, completing objectives faster than expected, showing skills that impressed even Price. The game doesn't explicitly show Price's internal thoughts, but his actions throughout their partnership suggest he saw potential in the young sergeant from their first meeting. If Soap could survive long enough to gain experience, if he learned when to follow orders and when to think for himself, if he developed the judgment that comes only from seeing combat, he could become exceptional. They didn't have to wait long for real combat. Intelligence indicated a cargo ship in the Bering Strait was carrying something very dangerous, nuclear material being transported by Russian ultranationalists. The destination and buyer were unknown, but stopping the shipment was critical. Price led Bravo team, including Soap, on a night insertion onto that cargo ship. The weather was brutal, storm winds rocking the vessel, rain reducing visibility to almost nothing, waves high enough to make even the helicopter approach dangerous. They fast-roped onto the deck in the darkness, immediately engaging hostile forces, fighting through narrow corridors and cargo holds. This was Soap's first real mission, his first time being shot at for real, his first time where mistakes meant death rather than just failing a training exercise. Price watched him during the action, saw how he handled the pressure, how he moved, how he made decisions. The kid was doing well, staying calm, following orders, but also showing initiative when situations called for it. They found the manifest in the captain's quarters, confirmed the cargo was a nuclear warhead being transported to a buyer. The buyer's name, Khaled al-Assad, a Middle Eastern extremist with ties to Russian ultranationalists. This was exactly what Western intelligence had feared: nuclear weapons proliferation to terrorist organizations, WMDs ending up in hands that wouldn't hesitate to use them against civilian populations. But before they could secure the package or complete their investigation, Russian MiG fighters appeared on the horizon, and the ship started taking hits. The vessel was going down, sinking into the Bering Strait, and Bravo team needed to evacuate immediately. In the chaos of the evacuation, as the ship tilted and began capsizing, Soap lost his footing, sliding toward the water. Price grabbed him, literally reached out and pulled him back from sliding overboard into the freezing ocean. First mission together, and Price had already saved Soap's life. It wouldn't be the last time. Over the coming missions, Price would save Soap repeatedly, and Soap would save Price, building the kind of bond that only forms in combat, the brotherhood that comes from knowing someone will literally die for you if necessary. But the situation was deteriorating rapidly beyond their team's operations. Russia was descending into civil war, ultranationalists versus loyalists, with Imran Zakhaev leading the ultranationalist movement. The same Zakhaev that Price had failed to kill 15 years earlier, now a powerful political and military leader with enough support to challenge the Russian government. Western powers, particularly the United States and Britain, supported the loyalists, conducting operations to prevent nuclear-armed Russia from falling under ultranationalist control. This put them on a collision course with Zakhaev's forces, leading to operations across the Middle East and Russia itself. The campaign played out across multiple operations that players experienced through different perspectives, sometimes as Soap with Price's team, sometimes as U.S. Marine Sergeant Paul Jackson fighting al-Assad's forces in the Middle East. But all the threads connected, all the operations aimed at preventing Zakhaev and his allies from acquiring or using nuclear weapons. Intelligence located al-Assad in a safe house, and Price's team conducted the raid that captured him. The interrogation should have provided crucial intelligence about Zakhaev's plans, about where other nuclear weapons might be, about what the ultranationalists were planning next. Instead, al-Assad smiled and delivered a chilling line. Imran Zakhaev is the safest man in the world. Seconds later, a nuclear device detonated in the capital city where 30,000 U.S. Marines, including Sergeant Jackson, were conducting operations. The explosion was visible from space, a new sun rising over the Middle East. The mushroom cloud a horrifying reminder that nuclear war wasn't just a Cold War fear, but a present reality. Sergeant Jackson's helicopter was caught in the blast wave, crashed in the radioactive ruins, and players experienced his final moments crawling through atomic devastation before dying of radiation exposure. 30,000 dead in the blink of an eye, vaporized or irradiated, gone before they knew what hit them. And Zakhaev's ultranationalists had announced to the world that they possessed nuclear weapons and were willing to use them without hesitation. The stakes had escalated from high to apocalyptic. Price knew who was behind this. Al-Assad was just a puppet, a proxy doing Zakhaev's bidding. The real threat was Zakhaev himself, the same man who'd escaped at Pripyat, the one who got away. And Price was determined that this time, there would be no escape. The hunt for Zakhaev took Price and his team through Azerbaijan, into the Caucasus Mountains, tracking leads and eliminating enemy forces. Every mission brought them closer, but Zakhaev was always protected, always one step ahead, always escaping before they could close the trap. Finally, intelligence pinpointed Zakhaev's location at a ballistic missile facility in the Altai Mountains. The ultranationalists were planning to launch ICBMs at the United States, nuclear revenge for Western involvement in the Russian Civil War, a strike that would kill millions and potentially trigger full nuclear exchange. This was it, the ultimate mission, the one that would determine whether the world descended into nuclear holocaust or pulled back from the brink. Price, Soap, Gaz, and an American Marine named Griggs led a combined SAS and Marine assault force into that facility, fighting through bunkers and launch silos, racing against a countdown that measured in minutes. The fighting was intense, some of the most desperate combat Price had experienced. Waves of ultranationalists defending their position, knowing that if they failed, their entire movement would collapse. But Price's team fought through them, pushing forward with determination born of knowing what failure meant. They reached the control room with seconds to spare. Soap uploaded the abort codes, and across the Atlantic Ocean, the ICBMs self-destructed safely in the upper atmosphere. The east coast of the United States was saved, millions of lives preserved, but Zakhaev was escaping, and Price wasn't about to let that happen again. They pursued in trucks, a desperate chase through the mountains, hunting the man who'd caused so much death and destruction. Then an enemy Hind helicopter appeared, and everything went sideways. The Hind destroyed a bridge ahead of them, cutting off escape routes. A tanker truck on the bridge exploded, the massive blast throwing everyone from the vehicles, bodies tumbling across concrete and rebar. Price opened his eyes to ringing ears and blurred vision. He was badly wounded, bleeding from multiple injuries, struggling to move. He could see Soap nearby, also hurt but conscious. Gaz and Griggs were down, possibly dead, their status unknown. And approaching through the smoke and flames came three figures, Imran, Zakhaev, and two bodyguards. Zakhaev walked forward slowly, savoring the moment, his missing left arm a reminder of their encounter 15 years earlier. He pulled out a Desert Eagle pistol, aiming at the wounded operators who'd hunted him so relentlessly. This was his revenge, his moment of triumph, finally eliminating the people who'd caused him so much trouble. Price tried to move, tried to raise his weapon, but his body wouldn't respond. He'd been hurt too badly in the explosion, had lost too much blood. Zakhaev stood over them, taking his time, enjoying their helplessness. Then a loyalist helicopter appeared, firing on the Hind, destroying it in a fireball. The explosion distracted Zakhaev for a crucial moment, and Price knew this was their only chance. Using the last of his strength, every remaining ounce of energy in his broken body, Price slid his M1911 pistol across the concrete towards Soap. It wasn't a large gesture, wasn't dramatic or showy, just a simple slide of metal on pavement, but it meant everything. Price was passing more than just a weapon. He was passing trust, responsibility, the role of the one who takes the final shot. He was saying in that wordless gesture that he believed in Soap, that his protege was ready, that if anyone could finish this, it was him. Soap grabbed the pistol with shaking, blood-covered hands. He'd been hurt in the explosion too, was barely holding on, but he lined up the shot. 3 targets, 3 bodyguards plus Zakhaev himself, and Soap was using a pistol he'd never fired before while severely wounded. He fired anyway. 3 shots, precise and lethal. The first bodyguard dropped. The second bodyguard fell. And Zakhaev, the man who'd started all this, who'd orchestrated nuclear detonations and civil war and countless deaths, collapsed with a bullet in his head. Finally, after 15 years, after Pripyat and everything that followed, Zakhaev was dead. The mission was complete, but the cost had been severe. Gaz and Griggs were confirmed killed in action, their bodies recovered from the wreckage. Price collapsed, Russian medics rushing to his side, his condition unknown. The last thing Soap saw was Price being worked on by medical personnel, unsure if his captain would survive. Soap was pulled away to evacuation, Price left behind in Russian hands, and as the screen faded to black, no one knew if Captain Price had lived or died. The mission was accomplished, Zakhaev was eliminated, the nuclear threat was neutralized. But at what cost? The answer to that question wouldn't come for years, during which Soap was promoted to captain, during which Task Force 141 was formed under General Shepard's command, during which the ultranationalists, despite losing Zakhaev, managed to consolidate power in Russia anyway. A new threat emerged, Vladimir Makarov, who'd been Zakhaev's right-hand man, who was even more radical and willing to use terror to achieve his goals. And somewhere, in a Russian prison far from civilization, Captain John Price sat in a cell, forgotten by the world, a political prisoner with no official existence. Prisoner number 627, they called him, and he would stay in that gulag for 5 long years, until the day a former protege came to rescue him, until the day Captain Soap McTavish led Task Force 141 into hell to bring him home. But that's a story for the next chapter. Thank you for watching this comprehensive exploration of Captain Price's complete story. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please like and subscribe to Mental Lullaby for more extensive video game lore analysis. We bring you the stories behind gaming's most iconic characters with the depth and detail they deserve. Until next time, stay safe out there.